Hello, and welcome to I Hate Talking, a podcast about talking, including etymology, frustrating topics, current events, and other random subjects. I'm Adam.
And I'm Steph. We are married, and we invite you into these discussions with us as we talk about the good and the bad of talking.
We hope you enjoy today's episode.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. We are on episode 9 of I Hate Talking. Today, we want to discuss the word or phrase, active listening. Adam, what do you think that means?
So before I give you the definition that comes to my mind for this particular phrase, it is interesting to note that this is the very first time that our word or phrase of the episode is actually a phrase. Because in our previous 8 episodes, it has been a single word that we have discussed, although maybe 1 or 2 or even 3 words that we've discussed. It's always been a singular word, even though one of those seemed like a phrase, milady.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, it is our actual first phrase of the episode. And when I think of the term or phrase active listening, I think of being able to listen and give attention to the person that is talking rather than preparing the response that you will give to them.
Yeah. First, that's so interesting. I love that you could recall and remember back to the word, my lady. I always thought that was a phrase. And every time I've been using it a lot lately. And I think about it as one word now versus a phrase. But yeah, you're right. Active listening, according to the definition, requires you to listen attentively to the speaker, understand what they're saying, respond and reflect on what's being said, and retain the information for later.
Very interesting. So do you think, to build on our previous episode, that the internal processor, or those that are going to be the nonverbal processor, versus the verbal processor, or as we have said in the previous episode, the external processor, is going to be more apt one way or the other to be a active listener?
I mean, I think stereotypically, you would think the quiet person is listening, and the person that speaks more often is not as prone to listen. But I also feel like the quiet person may be sitting there quietly thinking about what they're going to say next, not necessarily listening. It's not indicative that they're listening to the conversation at hand.
I think that's a very astute observation, because even as you're talking, I am thinking about what I'm going to say next and not necessarily exactly what you're saying, though I certainly am listening. I am in some ways, again, going back to our previous episodes, parallel processing in terms of being able to listen to what you're saying, but also preparing my remarks in response to what you're saying.
Okay, so anyone listening to this, I would love to hear from y'all. You can email or comment on this, however the device you're listening to allows you to. And our email is always in the description also. But my question, I cannot physically listen to something and think about my thoughts as well. They're very, in my brain, very separate. So if I'm listening to what you're saying, my brain is blank and I'm hearing what you're saying, filtering that, and then it comes out, sometimes just spills out, which isn't eloquent or isn't great. But and so I understand that you often come out much more eloquent just in daily conversations. So how are you able to listen to what I'm saying right now? Also think about what you're going to say next. Or was everything I said blank to you as well?
It certainly was not blank. I certainly was listening to everything that you said, but at the same time, I'm also considering what I'm going to say. And I think that is even a callback to even earlier episodes when we are talking about certain categories of people with the introvert and the highly sensitive and the internal processor, as well as the potentially failure to be an active listener, as being some overlap with particular personality types or particular traits that a person may possess. That again, they may not exclusively possess those and may not 100% overlap all the time, but that there does seem to be a particular overlap in the majority of cases of an introvert and highly sensitive and internal processor. And I think in this case, a drawback in terms of their ability to, and my ability to be an active listener.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I think it's so interesting. We'll have many other opportunities, I'm sure, just to dive deeper into this as we go on. But it's so interesting to me just how people are built so differently and the benefits and difficulties of that. Even as you're talking at one moment, I thought about like, what would I say next? Oh, I should say this. And then in my head, I was like, oh, I don't know what he just said. So I'm not even going to say what I was thinking about because I feel like it's a moot point. If I'm focused so much on what I'm going to say next, that I'm not listening to who is speaking, what I'm saying is just, I should just be in my bathroom talking to myself then at that point. Because I'm not caring what you're saying. I'm only caring about what I'm saying.
So that's an interesting observation. So in that case, you would actually say that when you are trying to prepare a response because you are thinking about it, that your auditory senses, in all intents and purposes, turns off and you are no longer able to listen to the other side of the conversation.
Definitely. And I don't know if that is a active versus an active listener or I guess passive listener. I don't know if that would be the opposite. But I do know that for myself, I have sensory things where like my sweet husband here, he loves to drive with the windows when it's a good weather day. We don't get that many great weather days here. But when it is, he loves to drive with the windows down. And I want to claw my ears out. I hate the sound of white noise no matter what. And when we had young babies that would wake up, people would tell me put white noise in so they'd sleep. I just couldn't do it. I just can't process all that extra noise. I can either focus on what he's saying or I can focus on the fan behind me or the people aside me or all that. And my brain cannot split into different areas. It's one or nothing.
So I think the opposite of an active listener is not necessarily one that does not listen, but one that is distracted while listening. Because again, they may be preparing their response or they may not be paying attention and empathizing with the person that they are talking to, but rather they are focused on some other aspect of either the conversation or their own thought process.
Yeah, I think active listener in that sense can mean a lot of things. So as you're talking, I listened to something just today. I've given him a shout out before. Forgive me because he's my favorite podcaster right now that I'm listening to. But Dr. John Deloney is he has a podcast. He does a lot of mental health, and I love listening to him and how he helps people through daily lives. Today, I listened to a episode he did where he was talking to a mom, and she was explaining how her husband was frustrated that she could not remember very well. And so I was like, oh, I forget things all the time. This is super relatable. And what he was saying was that she has basically a million tabs open constantly. Essentially, every time her phone dings for a notification, her kid says something, whatever's happening, whatever she's listening to, it's a constant ding in her brain that's refocusing her on something else. So she's not ever focused on one thing. And as he had some great recommendations. But what I took away from it was thinking, yeah, about a month ago or maybe 6 weeks ago, just so happens that my phone, I think one of my children had my phone, and they deleted my home page on my phone. I do not see messages, emails, social media things any longer unless I specifically sign into that app. And at first it's super frustrating. Now it's amazing because I do a specific time twice a day where I sit down and I check all my messages from every app, which is insane. We have so many apps nowadays from all my apps. And I feel like I've been much more present with my children throughout the day. And I've been much more focused on one task where I start doing a little bit of something and I stop and do something else and stop. But without having all those dings and bells in my head, I'm able to focus on what's ahead. And I think about it as we're talking. Like if I'm listening to you, I'm listening to you. But if somebody else is saying something or something, the oven's going off or anything like that, I'm having a hard time giving you the attention I think you deserve.
Yeah, I think there is something to be said of the ability to multitask, and that is, I think, something that is necessary for the preservation of safety. You need to be able to see what's going on at different times and be able to recognize potential dangers while you're maybe doing something of value or working or spending time with those that you love, that you're still somewhat alert to those things that may be a danger to you. However, in this modern day and age, I think we've hijacked that multitasking aspect of the human mind and overloaded it with the potential for all these different notifications and all these different alerts. And it is quite a struggle to be able to deal with all those things. And it does, in some ways, not allow us to achieve a state of flow where we are engaged with the person that we're talking to or with the task at hand.
Yeah. So, as you would tend to believe that you can listen and think at the same time simultaneously, do you think that you're good at multitasking in that respect?
So people have told me that I am good at multitasking, and I guess I tend to agree with them to a degree. But it does come down to multitasking between audio and visual inputs, because I think that personally, and maybe for everyone, that you cannot multitask for the same type of input for an extended period of time. So if you're visually managing a lot of things or you're auditorily managing a lot of things, that at some point you will become overwhelmed with those things. But I think my particular instance of where people can comment on either my multitasking ability or where I perceive that I have a multitasking ability is when I can handle a auditory input and a visual input at the same time.
Okay. I can see that. So, as you're thinking currently right now, can you hear what I'm saying to you though?
Yes, I can hear everything that you're saying.
Because I think that if I'm driving and I'm listening, I can do both well, I think. I haven't gotten in an accident. Another mom flex is I can talk to people and I feel like I'm very engaged in what they're saying. And I'm able to like catch the ball or catch the kid that's tumbling off the thing, but still be fully present in the conversation. Mine comes, so I feel like listening and physical for me, I can do both at the same time. It's when I have to think, when I have to speak and listen. Those two in my brain do not.
Yes, and I think that in some instances that also could be, again, potentially a internal versus external processor, because do you have any instances where you're unable to speak and read different content at the same time?
Oh yeah. Okay, that's great. Yes, I there's no way I can read something and speak at the same time. Or even if someone else is speaking, I cannot read at the same time.
But you could speak the exact written words that's on a paper that you are reading aloud.
But I may not. Also, may just be weird for me. Y'all let us know. I have a harder time processing what I just spoke if I'm reading it myself. I will remember it better if I read it quietly than if I read it out loud.
Because you're using your mental facilities to actually speak the words
Mm-hmm.
rather than read them and interpret them and internalize them.
Mm-hmm. I think so. What about you?
So again, I will actually read ahead of what I am physically
How do you
speaking.
do that, man?
So I can actually read, a couple words ahead or maybe even a sentence ahead before I'm actually physically speaking those words. And in some instances, for example, when I'm reading a book to the children or reading a particular Bible study or sermon meditation, I will actually change some of the words to be a more appropriate for the audience because I'm actually reading a few words ahead or sentences ahead so that I can change those things before I actually physically speak them.
Man, you're a superhero. Okay, y'all, can you do that too? Because that's so amazing. Did you learn that or have you always had that ability?
I do not particularly remember a time, quote unquote, learning that ability. I think that that is one of the particular attributes that I do consider as a differential between myself and others is the ability to read, because the ability to read will give you so much ability to comprehend and be successful because you're able to take in that knowledge and then be able to understand it, internalize it, and then share it with others.
Hmm. Okay. That's good news and bad news. That I can't just train myself to do that.
And I think that there is the ability to learn nonetheless. And that does bring us to the next point in our conversation is reading either visually or through audio. So are they one and the same? And are they equivalent in terms of their value and impact?
Oh, I have strong opinions on that. You go first. Is my Audible, does that count as a book I read this year?
So I would still lean towards that it is not quote unquote reading, but I have come to the conclusion more recently that it is still a valid use of the written language and a valid way to learn new things through audiobooks.
Okay. According to my Goodreads, my audiobooks are just as equivalent as your hard copy books.
And that is what a number of studies have shown recently is that listening to an audiobook or listening to some sort of audio of a particular subject is just as impactful and can be retained in terms of the knowledge that it imparts just as well as reading the written word if you pay attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just not background noise. I can see that. Currently, I've been having a lot of migraines, and it's not fun. My sympathies to anyone who has migraines. But when open up a book, I find myself reading the same line over and over and not remembering for the life of me what I just read. But for an audiobook, like you said, I have to focus on it. I can't just have it as background noise. But if I'm doing the dishes and I'm listening or something like that, I can retain that information so much greater than if I sat with that book in front of me for an hour.
Exactly. And I think that is the critical point, is that it cannot just be background noise. It has to be in the forefront of your mind, and that it has to be understood and internalized as you're listening to it. And that the particular studies that I've also looked at that indicate that reading is more impactful is due to exclusively the fact that listening to something, you are more prone to distraction.
Okay, because your eyes are focused on other things versus the physical letters on the page.
Yes, I'd have to do some more reading on the
I
subject,
love that.
but it does seem that when you are listening to a particular subject, that perhaps, yes, your eyes will wander, or because you are free to do other tasks such as driving or laundry or whatever the case may be, that then you may be consumed with thinking about those things and
Mhm.
therefore not give your full attention to the audio that you're listening to.
Yeah, fair enough. I can see that. Um, this reminds me of a discussion we were having recently where for me, if I just sit still, if we're having a conversation, I can sit still overall. Like I said, I can catch a kid who's about to fall and still be engaged in the conversation. I can catch the ball that's coming towards us. But if I'm sitting maybe in a lecture or something like that, I usually have to take taking notes or even doodling. And you might think, oh, she's just drawing a flower. She's not paying attention at all. But if I'm doodling, drawing that flower, I retain that information so much better and can share it with you later than if I'm just staring blankly at the person. So I think that's what you're saying, right? Is that's audible. I'm listening to that speaker. I'm actively listening. Actively listening isn't necessarily just staring at the individual, but it could be doing something with your body so your brain can focus on what's at hand.
Exactly. So I think that whether we are reading the written word or we are listening to the words that are spoken, the most critical component is our attention
Mm-hmm.
and our active participation in that particular reading or conversation or listening, and that we must not be distracted in any of those scenarios
Mm-hmm.
in order to understand.
Yeah. So yeah, if I'm not doodling or writing notes, I get distracted by so and so scratching their head or your whatever's happening. So for you, since your brain works vastly different than mine, what are you doing when you're either reading a book or listening to someone lecture where you're not like as a book, you're not expected to give a rebuttal right away. When you're listening to a lecture, you're not expected to rebuttal right away. So not in a conversation, but in those two situations, what is your body doing or your brain doing?
So my brain may be actually arguing with the author,
Hmm.
but I think that may be another topic that we can explore
Mm-hmm.
more in the future. So, one other thing to consider for any of our listeners that are not convinced that audiobooks are just as valid as reading
They
a physical
are.
book is think back to your childhood and how did you begin to learn how to read? It was through, in most cases, listening to a book being read to you.
mind blown. He looked at me instantly because he knows what I'm going to say. Because he knows how I learned to read. Because we are a homeschool family. I teach our kids the way I learned. Because that's what I know. It worked. I'm proficient in reading. That's what we do. Okay, tell me, did you learn differently than me and my kids learn? Do we need
Perhaps,
to change? We have one more that doesn't know how to read yet. Do we need to change our methods?
indeed, there has been times in my childhood that I can remember being read to or listening to a audiobook, and those are some particular memories that I cherish. So I think that is true, that we can learn not only through the written word being read, but also it being read to us. And that journey to understanding can begin at a very young age.
Okay, great. That's good to know. Because initially, when you said that and looked at me, I got nervous because I was raised very much in audio stories. Back then, it was cassettes we listened to, and then it moved to CDs. My kids now listen to CDs and just stream it. And then also, my family was very big on read alouds. So we do that kind of thing. I thought we were messing them up. We had one more kid to save them to have this brilliant brain. But okay, so our other three are not ruined yet. And there's chance of them loving stories and being read to. So thank you. So from your friends, I hate talking. Until next time, remember it's only through talking that we begin the journey to understanding.